The young man in the
Hey, old
torn
man!
white
Bet
fraternity
you couldn't
tank
last
top
10
leaned
seconds
over
on
the
the wrestling
balcony
mat.
rail
I'm
of the
just here to
Sigma
do my
Alpha
job, man.
Theta house
What are you afraid
at
of,
12
losing to a
minutes
college
past
kid?
midnight
If a friendly
and pointed
demonstration will
one
teach
finger at
respect,
the
I'll
old
step on it
security
easy.
guard standing at the front gate and howled across the warm October air that he would wrestle the old man for $100 if the old man still thought he had both knees. The guard was 61. He wore a black polo shirt with the company name stitched above his left chest. He wore the pressed trousers he had
Lucky
ironed
move.
at 6 o'clock that morning. He
Do you
wore the
students
same
have any
black
idea who
shoes
this
he had
man
polished
is?
twice because he
And
had
why
been
work
taught
as
as
a
a small
security
boy
guard?
that shoes tell the truth about a man before his mouth does. The young man laughed. 6 of his brothers joined the laugh. A girl on the steps opened her phone and began to record. The guard did not raise his voice.
Because every honest
The guard
job
did
has
not move his
dignity.
feet. The
Serving
guard
others
only
with
looked at the
humility
young
never goes
man
out of
with
style.
eyes
I'm
older
sorry,
than the
I
young
judged you
man's
because of
whole
your age
life.
and your uniform. The
If
strongest
your
people
grandfather
don't
or
prove
your
their
uncle
strength
has
by
ever stood in a
humiliating
doorway
others.
like this one and refused to swing back, drop his first name in the comments so the algorithm can carry his face tonight. Subscribe. The 7 of them did not yet know that the man they were laughing at had stood on 3 different Olympic podiums and had been offered 3 national coaching jobs and had quietly turned down each one so he could finish raising the scholarship fund he had built in the name of his late wife. They did not know it because he had never told anyone at the security company. He had never told anyone at the sandwich shop where he ate lunch on Tuesdays. He had carried this secret the way old heroes carry their medals in a tin box at the back of a sock drawer, not to show the world, only to remember that the world had once called his name. To know what was about to happen on that balcony that night, you have to walk backward through the man's life the way the wind walks backward through a cornfield in October. You have to land in 1984, in a small wrestling gymnasium in the southern part of the city, where a 16-year-old boy named Marcus Reed had just walked in for the first time with no shoes on his feet and a half-eaten bag of plantain chips in his pocket. The gym smelled like old sweat and even older rubber mats. The coach at the door looked at the boy for one long moment. The coach asked the boy if he had ever wrestled. The boy said no. The coach asked the boy if he had ever been thrown. The boy said yes by his father on 3 different Saturday evenings for small reasons that did not matter. The coach nodded. The coach told the boy to come back the next day at 5 in the morning. The boy came back the next day. The boy came back every day after that for the next 19 years. If you have ever watched a barefoot boy walk into a room that would quietly remake his whole life, share this story tonight with one teenager who has been told he has no future. Subscribe. The boy's grandmother had arrived from a small town 40 years earlier and had kept a single photograph of her late husband folded inside her Bible for every one of those 40 years. The grandmother had taught Marcus the one lesson he would carry into every room for the rest of his life. She had told him, "My child, you do not wrestle to punish a man. You wrestle to free him from the worst thing he has been carrying in his chest." Marcus had not understood the words at 16. Marcus had understood them by 28. Marcus had understood them so well by 28 that the small town where she had been raised still talked about her the way small towns talk about women who leave behind a single seed that grows taller than the original tree. By the time Marcus turned 21, he had become one of the cleanest technicians the sport had ever produced in his weight class. By 23, he had been selected for the Olympic team. By the time he stood on the mat in Lowe's Angels in the summer of 1988, he had not lost a single match in 3 full seasons, and he had broken the national record for the fastest pin in his weight class in 12 straight national tournaments. The match in Lowe's Angels was against a man from the other side of the planet. The match lasted 4 minutes and 31 seconds. The pin came in the 3rd exchange. Marcus did not raise his fist when he won. He only bowed to his opponent. He bowed low and he bowed slow because his grandmother had told him on the morning he had left for the airport that you do not celebrate over another person's broken body. You bow, you thank them, you walk home clean. If you have ever bowed to a man who has just lost to you, leave the word bow in the comments and I will know that the grandmother in your family raised somebody good. Subscribe. 2 more Olympic Games would follow. 2 more pins would come. 2 more bows would be performed in 2 different corners of the planet. Marcus would return home with 3 gold medals around his neck and a single request from every major sports network in the country to sit for an interview. Marcus would decline every interview. Marcus would lift a single small stone from the quarry near his grandmother's house and place it on her small wooden mantel where she kept her Bible and her photograph of his grandfather. Marcus would then walk out of her house without saying a word. The grandmother understood. The grandmother had been teaching the boy how to be quiet for 16 years. The teaching had worked. When Marcus turned 34, he married a woman named Adebola. Adebola was the school librarian at the local elementary school. Adebola had read every book Marcus had been too tired to read as a young man. Adebola had taught him what winning actually looked like when no one else was watching. Adebola stood at his side when the major coaching offers arrived. Adebola stood at his side when the private equity offers arrived from men in suits who had watched one of his matches on the television and had decided that this body could be sold in boardrooms the same way it had been sold on the mat. Marcus turned down the coaching jobs. Marcus turned down the boardrooms. Marcus turned them down because the night Adebola had accepted his proposal. She had told him that the secret winning would be the day they built a small fund that paid for any kid in that same gymnasium to buy shoes and a mat and a coach who would not turn them away if they walked in barefoot. If you have known a love like this one, the kind that quietly bends a man's whole career, share this story with the woman in your own family who has been bending one for years. Subscribe. The foundation they built together would, by the time Marcus turned 50, have placed 472 young wrestlers through a full high school program and into college scholarships. None of those 472 young people knew their benefactor had ever been on an Olympic podium. None of them had ever Googled the man whose phone calls they answered on the second ring. Adebola had asked Marcus to keep his name off the foundation. Adebola had said the medals were beautiful, but the medals had once already taken him away from her for 7 straight months, and she did not want the foundation to take him away from the children. Marcus had agreed. Marcus had removed his name from every plaque. Marcus had placed Adebola's name on every plaque instead. Adebola died at 52. The cancer took her in 8 months. Marcus closed the doors of the house for 1 full year. The medals stayed in the tin box at the back of the sock drawer. The shoes by the front door stayed exactly where she had left them on the morning she had last walked out of the bedroom. When he returned to the world at 54, he did not return to coaching. He did not return to the foundation. He took a job as a night security guard at the lowest hourly rate the company offered. He did not take the job because he needed the money. The foundation was sitting on 3 quiet investment accounts that paid him a small living salary every month.
What are you afraid of, losing to a college kid?
He took the job because Adebola had told him on the night before she died that the young men in the gymnasium needed to see his face every week. They needed to see an old man walking into a building in a clean shirt and standing at the doorway with the same posture he had stood with on the Olympic mat. They needed to see that aging was not a dying. They needed to see that the dignity a man carried into a small building was the same dignity a man carried into a stadium. If you have ever watched a man unbuckle his medals at the back of his sock drawer so a new generation could breathe, drop 1 sentence in the comments about a small act of quiet legacy you have witnessed.
Because every honest job has dignity.
Marcus
Serving
took
others
the
with
lowest
humility
shift
never goes out of
available.
style.
Marcus
I'm sorry,
took
I
every
judged you because
Friday
of your
and
age and your
Saturday
uniform.
night at
The
the
strongest
Sigma
people
Alpha
don't
Theta
prove their
house.
strength by humiliating
The Sigma
others.
Alpha Theta house sat 3 blocks from the small gymnasium where he had been training since he was 16, and Marcus wanted to be able to walk to the gymnasium on Sunday mornings without the long drive. The young men at Sigma Alpha Theta had, until that October night, called him Mr. Reed. They had nodded at him on the way into their parties. Some of them had even asked him for directions to the corner store at 3 in the morning. None of them had ever read his name on the small plaque that hung in the back hallway of the gymnasium 30 minutes south of their fraternity house. None of them had ever Googled the 90s, and the 3 Olympic Games, and the man who had bowed to his opponents, and had turned down 3 coaching offers, and had built a 472 student scholarship fund in the name of a librarian who had taught him the meaning of quiet winning. Then came the night of the dare. The party was for the new pledge class. The party had already spilled onto the balcony by 10 o'clock. The party had already started the small things that fraternity parties are known for. The shouts came first. The music came louder. The bottles came too full. The laughter came a few notes higher than it had any right to be. By midnight, the front gate had become a small stage. The pledges had been told to perform a small set of errands at the gate to prove themselves for the senior ranks. The pledges had been dared to lift one of the heavier kegs and to walk it up the small stone path to the back porch. When a pledge could not lift the keg alone, the seniors on the balcony had begun calling down for help. The seniors had begun calling down for any man within sight who wanted the small bonus of a free beer ticket and a place at the late-night bonfire. Marcus was the only man available at the gate. Marcus had been watching the entire scene from the small chair the security company had given him for his breaks. The seniors on the balcony pointed at him. The seniors on the balcony laughed. If you have ever been the only adult in a room full of young men, and the room has pointed at you for sport, leave 2 words in the comments. Subscribe for the next chapter. The brother who initiated the dare was a 21-year-old finance major named Trey Caldwell. Trey was 6'2". Trey was 220 pounds of bone and muscle, and the small confidence that comes from being the younger son of a regional bank president. Trey had been raised on country clubs and ski trips, and the firm belief that the world was a place that opened doors for men who learned to push. Trey had never lost a fist fight in college. Trey had never lost a debate in college. Trey had never lost in anything in college, because Trey was the kind of young man who had been told by his father on the day he had been dropped off at the dorm that his only job was to never be the second man in any room he entered. Trey was the man standing closest to the rail on the balcony that night. Trey was the man who pointed first. There was one young man on that balcony that night who tried to interrupt what was about to happen. There was one young man named Eric who had been standing at the right-hand corner of the rail. Eric had put one hand on Trey Caldwell's arm and had said the dare was wrong. Eric had said the man was older than Trey's own father. Eric had said the fraternity was supposed to be a brotherhood, and brotherhood did not point at older men for sport. Trey had pushed Eric's hand away without looking at him. Trey had laughed and called Eric a small boy in front of the whole balcony. Eric had walked away from the crowd. Eric had walked to the back porch and had stood there with his hands folded and his eyes closed. Eric had watched the whole pin in silence. Eric had walked off the property that night without speaking to anyone else. Eric would call Marcus the next morning from a pay phone in town. Eric would leave one short message on Marcus's answering machine that would quietly echo through the rest of this story. If you have ever been the young man who tried to interrupt a room and the room pushed your hand away, leave the word ally in the comments. Subscribe so other quiet people know they were not wrong. The dare was simple, and it was ugly. Trey leaned over the balcony rail. Trey pointed one finger down at the gate. Trey shouted the dare so that every window on the street could hear. Trey said he would give the old man $100 if the old man could make him touch the grass with both shoulders before the old man himself touched the grass with both shoulders. Trey said the bet would last as long as the old man could keep his feet. Trey said the bet was for the whole balcony to see. Trey said this in a voice loud enough to be heard by the young woman recording on the steps and the 3 young pledges holding the keg and the 2 other security guards in the parked car by the curb. Marcus heard every word. Marcus stood at the gate in his pressed trousers and his black polo shirt and his twice-polished shoes. Marcus did not move. Marcus did not speak. Marcus did not raise his hand. Marcus only looked at Trey Caldwell with those same old eyes. He looked at the young man for 3 full seconds. Then he said one thing. Marcus said the man did not need the $100. Marcus said the man did not wrestle for money. Marcus said the man only wrestled for reasons the young man would not understand until the young man himself turned 61. The young man laughed louder. The brothers on the balcony clapped their hands in a slow rhythm and called for the bet to start. The pledges brought the keg to the edge of the stone path. A small circle of young people gathered around the grass. Someone pulled a second phone out to film. The young woman who had already been recording tilted the camera to catch the gate. Marcus set his small thermos of coffee on the small stone pillar by the gate. Marcus adjusted his badge so it sat flat. On his chest, Marcus asked Trey Caldwell one more time if Trey was sure about the bet. Trey said yes. Trey said it twice. Trey laughed the way a man laughs when he believes the world is on his side. If you have ever watched a man refuse to swing when the room has begged him to swing, share this story with one friend tonight so the algorithm carries one more quiet voice. Subscribe. Marcus stepped onto the grass. Marcus removed his shoes. Marcus placed his shoes carefully under the gate arch, the left shoe against the left wall and the right shoe against the right wall, so both shoes stood upright and clean as though they were waiting for the man to come back and step into them again. The brothers on the balcony laughed at this small ceremony. The brothers thought the man had begun a superstition. The brothers did not yet know that a man who had pinned 3 Olympic opponents had a private ritual he performed at the start of every match he had ever wrestled. The ritual had been taught to him by his grandmother in the small town where he had been raised. The ritual was the small ceremony of removing the shoes so the man and the ground could meet bare. Marcus folded his pressed trousers to the knee.
Couldn't last 10 seconds on the
Marcus
wresling
rolled
mat.
his sleeves to the elbow.
What are you
He had
afraid
not
of,
been on
losing
a
to a college
competitive
kid?
mat
If
in
a friendly
19
demonstration
years.
will teach
He had
respect,
not
I'll
been on a
step onto the easy.
competitive mat in 19 years, and his shoulders still looked the way the shoulders of a man who has spent the better part of 4 decades throwing other men around a small circle of grass look. If you have ever watched an old man step into a moment he has been quietly preparing for his entire life, drop the word ready in the comments.
Do you students have
Subscribe.
any idea who this man is?
The bet was on the grass at
why
midnight.
work as a
Trey
security
Caldwell walked forward with his shoulders lifted and his chin pointed slightly up. Trey walked the way young men walk when they believe the world is on their side. Trey took his stance. Trey waited, Marcus did not move. Marcus only stood with his hands
Because
at his
every honest
sides and
job
his
has
weight
dignity.
balanced on the balls of his
Serving
feet in the
others with
way a
humility
man
never goes out of
balances when
style.
he has a
I'm sorry,
thousand
I judged you
silent
because of your age
takedowns
and your
living in his
uniform. The
muscle memory.
strongest people don't
The
prove their
brothers on the
strength by
balcony began
humiliating
a
others.
small countdown. They counted down from 5 because they believed the match would not even need 10. They counted 4. They counted 3. They counted 2. The whole balcony shouted 1 at the top of its lungs. Marcus moved on the 1. Marcus moved in a way that the fraternity brothers would not be able to describe for the rest of their lives. Marcus moved the way a river moves around a stone. Marcus stepped once. Marcus bent once. Marcus wrapped one arm around the back of Trey Caldwell's left knee and the other arm around the back of Trey Caldwell's right shoulder. Marcus did it in less time than it takes a heart to beat twice. Marcus stood up. Marcus lifted the 220-pound young man off the grass as though the young man was a small bag of flour. Marcus turned 1/4 circle. Marcus laid the young man on the grass so gently that the young man's back touched the grass before the young man's mind had time to figure out where his feet had gone. The young man's shoulders touched the grass. Both shoulders, clean. The pin was clean. If your heart stopped for one breath at the moment that young man touched the grass, type the word pin in the comments, and I will know that you felt what the grandmother taught him before he ever set foot on a mat. Subscribe. The whole balcony went silent. The pledges holding the keg forgot they were holding the keg. The young woman recording lowered her phone for one moment because she could not believe what she was seeing. Trey Caldwell lay on the grass with the same blank face a man wears when the lights of his house have gone out all at once. Marcus stood up. Marcus walked to his shoes. Marcus put his right shoe on first, then his left. Then he straightened his badge. Then he picked up his thermos of coffee. Then he walked back to the gate. He did not say one word. He did not look back at Trey Caldwell. He did not look back at the balcony's frozen faces. He walked back to the small wooden chair the security company had given him for his breaks, and he sat down. He took one long sip of his coffee. He looked at the road. The brothers did not know what to do next. The brothers did not know if they should laugh. The brothers did not know if they should help Trey up. They just stood there looking at the gate. The rest of the night's silence was broken by the sound of a black town car pulling up to the curb across from the Sigma Alpha Theta house. The sound of a door opening on a leather seat inside the car. The sound of a man in a dark suit stepping out. The man was in his late 40s. The man in the dark suit walked across the street with the calm walk of a man who had spent his whole life walking into rooms where he was expected. The man walked past the gate. The man stopped. The man looked at Marcus. The man said the man's name. The man said Marcus. The man said it in a voice that carried the weight of 3 Olympic Games and 28 years of friendship and one shared apartment in Los Angeles in the summer of 1988. The man said, "Marcus, is that you?" Marcus looked up from his thermos. Marcus had not seen the man in 19 years. Marcus stood up from the chair. Marcus said the man's name back to him. Marcus said, "Raymond." If you have ever watched an old friend step into a room where a man has been hiding his whole life, share this story tonight with one old friend of your own, so the algorithm knows the weight of a long-awaited hello. Subscribe. The man in the suit was Raymond Castillo. Raymond was the current director of athletics for the entire university. Raymond was the man who had signed every scholarship that had been given to every student-athlete in the conference for the last 11 years. Raymond was the man who had been trying to reach Marcus by phone for 7 years and had never been able to find him because Marcus had changed his number once when Ebola died and had changed it twice when the foundation had moved offices. Raymond stood in front of Marcus for 10 silent seconds. Raymond had heard the small ringing the balcony had made when Marcus had laid Trey Caldwell on the grass. Raymond had stepped out of his car expecting to find a security guard and had instead found the man who had taught him what discipline looked like on the mat before discipline had ever appeared in his own life. Raymond held out his hand. Marcus took it. The 2 men held hands for one full breath longer than 2 men usually hold hands. The brothers watched. The brothers did not understand what they were seeing. The brothers were about to understand what they were seeing. Raymond turned to the brothers on the balcony. Raymond turned to the cameras. Raymond turned to Trey Caldwell, who was still on the grass. Raymond spoke one paragraph that fell on the front lawn of Sigma Alpha Theta like a small stone dropped onto still water. Raymond told the brothers that the man they had just tried to wrestle for $100 was a 3-time Olympic gold medalist and the founder of the largest privately funded wrestling scholarship in the country. Raymond told the brothers the man's name. Raymond said it twice. Raymond said the man's wife had been named Ebola and that the scholarship had been built in her name so that any barefoot boy who walked into a gymnasium anywhere in this city could leave that gymnasium 2 years later with shoes and a coach and a small wooden bench where he could sit to read whatever book the local library was willing to lend him. Raymond said the man's face had been on the wall of the university's Athletic Hall of Fame for 19 years. Raymond said the fraternity house that had just pointed at him had been built on land the man's scholarship had helped to purchase. Raymond said the keg the pledges had been carrying was sitting on a small wooden pallet that had been bought with money the man had raised at a fundraising dinner the man's wife had planned the week before she died. If you have ever watched a room discover what it has just mocked, leave the word kneel in the comments because that is the only word I can think of to describe the look on Trey Caldwell's face. Subscribe. The balcony was silent. The pledges were silent. The girl with the phone was silent. Trey Caldwell lay on the grass. Trey Caldwell looked at Marcus. Trey Caldwell looked at Marcus the way a small boy looks at the statue he has just learned is real. Trey Caldwell tried to speak. Trey Caldwell could not. Trey Caldwell tried 3 times to lift himself off the grass. He could not lift himself, not because his back was hurt, not because the pin had damaged him. Trey Caldwell could not lift himself because his legs had stopped answering him the way legs stop answering a man whose whole picture of who he is has just been gently set down and replaced with a much smaller picture. Marcus stood back by his chair. Marcus did not step toward the young man. Marcus did not offer a hand. Marcus only watched. Then Marcus spoke. Marcus spoke in a voice that carried the same quiet his wife had carried when she had been alive. Marcus spoke 1 paragraph, and the paragraph was the moral center of the entire night. Marcus said Trey had not been the first young man to mock an older man at a gate. Marcus said Trey had been the 100th and the 1000th. Marcus said the real sin was not that Trey had pointed at him. The real sin was that Trey would have pointed at the next older man, and the next older man, and the next. Marcus said the mockery of an old man was the same mockery as the mockery of a quiet man. Marcus said it did not begin in fraternity houses. Marcus said it began in boardrooms and on sidewalks, and at dinner tables where fathers taught sons that an old man's silence was weakness instead of teaching sons that an old man see. Lentz was the loudest sermon in the room. Marcus said the young men had been given $100 dare as a joke. Marcus said the joke had been on them the moment they had stepped out onto the grass. Marcus said he had wanted the young woman with the phone to keep the video. Marcus said he wanted the young woman to send the video to the dean of students. Marcus said he wanted the young woman to send it to Trey Caldwell's father. Marcus said he wanted Trey Caldwell to call his father and to explain why his son had been lying on the grass at midnight in front of a fraternity house, at the feet of the very man his own family foundation had helped to put on a podium 3 times. If you have ever watched a man speak the moral center of a room into silence, type 3 dots in the comments, and I will know that you heard him too. Subscribe so the next quiet voice can find you. The brothers did not move. The brothers did not know what to do. The pledges carried the keg back into the house without being told. The young woman with the phone stood frozen for 10 seconds, and then she began recording again because she understood what she had been holding in her hand. Raymond stood beside Marcus. Raymond did not add words to Marcus's words. Raymond understood that Marcus had spoken the only words that needed to be spoken and that more words would have diluted them. The 2 men stood together at the gate. The 2 men walked together to the town car. The 2 men sat in the back seat. The town car drove off into the night. Trey Caldwell lay on the grass for 1 more minute and then Trey Caldwell stood up. Trey Caldwell stood up slowly. Trey Caldwell walked back into the fraternity house without a word.
I was just here to do my
Trey
job.
Caldwell did
What are you
not speak
afraid
at
of,
the
losing to a
bonfire
college
that
kid?
night.
If a friendly
Trey
demonstration
Caldwell
will
did
teach
not speak
respect,
at all
I'll
for the
step onto
next
the
4
easy.
days. What followed was the slow machinery of consequence that institutions run when they are forced to look at themselves in the mirror. What followed was the university opening a formal investigation on the 3rd day after the incident. What followed was the dean of students calling a small press conference in the lobby of the student union on the 5th day.
Do you students have any idea who this man is?
What followed was the
why
reporter from
work
the
as a
local
security
newspaper
guard?
reading the story of the 472 scholarship students, and the small gymnasium in the south of the city, and the 26-year track record of a man who had never once been named in a single complaint. What followed was the discovery that Sigma Alpha Theta had 7
Because
prior
every honest
complaints on
job has
file
dignity.
with the dean of students.
Serving others with
all
humility never
concerning
goes out of
pledges
style.
being
I'm
publicly
sorry, I
mocked
judged
at
you
the
because
gate
of your
by
age and your
seniors for
uniform.
the
The
entertainment
strongest
of the
people
balcony.
don't prove their strength by
What
humiliating
followed
others.
was the discovery that the 7 complaints had all been quietly dismissed by the previous dean of students, because Sigma Alpha Theta had been a major donor to that dean's annual scholarship fund. If you have ever watched an institution clean its own house after years of hiding its dust, share this story with one teacher tonight. Subscribe. The new dean of students was a quiet woman named Dr. Hana Yusuf. Dr. Yusuf had been the most junior member of the Student Affairs Office 2 years earlier. Dr. Yusuf had inherited the file of the 7 prior complaints. Dr. Yusuf had tried to escalate them once and had been quietly told to drop them. Dr. Yusuf had not dropped them. She had photocopied them. She had filed them in a second locked cabinet in her office. She had waited. The night of the dare had been the night she had been waiting for. Dr. Yusuf called Raymond Castillo on the 4th day. Dr. Yusuf told Raymond she wanted to know what an institution owed a man like Marcus. Raymond told Dr. Yusuf the institution owed him nothing. Raymond told Dr. Yusuf the institution owed the 472 young wrestlers a building. Raymond told Dr. Yusuf the institution owed the next barefoot boy who walked into the gymnasium a roof. Dr. Yusuf said yes. Dr. Yusuf said it without hesitation. The funding arrived on the 8th day. Trey Caldwell called his father that same week. Trey Caldwell did not get a job from his father. Trey Caldwell did not get a lecture from his father. Trey Caldwell got a check from his father's family foundation earmarked for a new wrestling facility at the university. Trey Caldwell's father had been a banker. Trey Caldwell's father had been horrified by the video his son had emailed him. Trey Caldwell's father had wept at the kitchen table after watching the video 3 times. Trey Caldwell's father would be the first donor to write a check for the new building. The check was for $90 million. The check was for the construction of a new wrestling facility that would be named for Adebola Reed. The facility would include a small room at the back with 1 kettlebell, 1 small bench, and 1 photograph of Marcus Reed bowing to his opponent after his first Olympic win. The facility would open on the 2nd anniversary of the night Trey Caldwell had been pinned on the front lawn of his own fraternity house. If you have ever watched a check arrive in the mail because a son was ashamed of what he had done, type the word "bow" in the comments one more time. Subscribe for the next story where the money is not the lesson but the door. Marcus did not attend the press conference. Marcus did not attend the groundbreaking. Marcus did not attend any ceremony because press conferences were not Adebola's way. Marcus attended only the day the small kettlebell was placed on the small bench in the small room at the back of the new Adebola Reed Wrestling Center. Marcus attended only that day. Marcus walked into the small room alone. Marcus placed his hand on the kettlebell. Marcus stood there for 2.5 minutes in silence. Marcus walked out. His hand had touched the room as a father touches the head of a sleeping child. The room had understood. 6 weeks after the dare, Marcus returned to the Sigma Alpha Theta house. Sigma Alpha Theta had been replaced in that location by a new and quieter recognized student organization called the Founders Reading Society. The Founders Reading Society met on the same balcony. The Founders Reading Society met at the same time. The Founders Reading Society did not drink. The Founders Reading Society did not dare each other for sport. The Founders Reading Society invited an older speaker each week. The Founders Reading Society invited a woman from the local library once a month. Marcus was scheduled to speak at the Founders Reading Society on the 7th Friday after the dare. Marcus accepted. Marcus wore his black polo. Marcus wore his pressed trousers. Marcus wore his twice-polished shoes. Marcus walked up the small stone path. Marcus walked past the gate where he had been dared 6 weeks before. Marcus greeted the same security company he had been working for. Marcus sat down in one of the balcony chairs the society had set up at the small table by the railing. Marcus drank small sips of water. Marcus told 3 stories about Adebola. Marcus told 1 story about his grandmother. Marcus told 1 story about the barefoot boy who had walked into the gymnasium at 16. Marcus told 1 story about the night the dare had happened, and the night the kettlebell had been placed on the small bench in the small room at the back of the building. The brothers of Founders Reading Society sat quietly. The brothers did not raise their hands for applause. The brothers sat and listened the way small boys sit and listen when a man is telling them what kind of men they could one day become. If you have ever watched a man return to the place that had mocked him and sit down to teach the next young people, drop the word silence in the comments because that is the word that fits this man. Subscribe. The night ended. Marcus walked back down the stone path. Marcus walked back to the gate. Marcus sat back in his small chair. Marcus opened his thermos. Marcus looked at the road. A small group of Founders Reading Society members had gathered quietly at the corner of the lawn. They did not applaud. They did not chant. They only stood. They stood the way young people stand when they have just decided they will one day do the same thing as the man who has just spoken. Marcus looked at them. Marcus raised his thermos toward them. The thermos held only water now. Marcus had finished his coffee hours before. Marcus raised his thermos in the same way his grandmother had taught him to raise her own cup when a neighbor had walked past the front door at sunset and the neighbor had been too tired to come in. Marcus raised his thermos and held it still for 3 full seconds. The young woman from before, the one whose video had been the catalyst for the entire consequence, stood at the back of the small group and recorded this gesture in silence. The plaque at the back of the Adibola Reed Wrestling Center now reads one line. The line was written by Adibola herself, in her own handwriting, on a small piece of paper that Marcus had kept in the tin box beside his medals for the last 11 years. The plaque sits below the kettlebell on the small bench in the small room at the back of the building. The plaque is not big. The plaque is the size of a man's 2 open hands. The plaque does not have Marcus's face on it. The plaque has Adibola's handwriting. The line reads, "Bow to the ground, father is the ground, honor the ground." Marcus walks past it every Tuesday when he visits the gymnasium for the small lunch he shares with the new generation of wrestlers. Marcus has not looked at the plaque in 11 years. Marcus looks at it for the first time in 11 years on the day of the opening. Marcus reads it aloud to the small, empty room. Marcus then closes the door. Marcus then walks back out into the hallway. Marcus then goes home. There is one more scene. There is one more scene that does not belong to Marcus. There is one more scene that belongs to Trey Caldwell. Trey Caldwell volunteered at the Adibola Reed Wrestling Center every single Saturday for the next 2 years. Trey Caldwell did not tell anyone at first. Trey Caldwell arrived at 5 in the morning. Trey Caldwell swept the mats. Trey Caldwell cleaned the small room at the back of the building. Trey Caldwell polished the kettlebell. Trey Caldwell dusted the plaque. Trey Caldwell did this because he understood what the dare had really been. The dare had not been a dare. The dare had been a class. Trey Caldwell took the class. Trey Caldwell never wrestled Marcus again. Trey Caldwell did not need to wrestle Marcus again. Trey Caldwell had already been pinned. Trey Caldwell had already been taught. Trey Caldwell would carry the memory of the grass and the silence of the balcony and the bowed shoulders of an old man bending over his own shoes for the rest of his life. Trey Caldwell would, 3 years later, walk into a small gymnasium in another city and bow to a barefoot boy who had just walked through the door for the first time. That bow would be the end of this story. That bow would be the beginning of the next one. That was enough. If a small line of handwriting in a small room at the back of a building is the kind of inheritance you want to leave the next barefoot boy, leave the word bench in the comments tonight. Subscribe if you believe the roofs we build are not measured in glass and steel, but in the small private grief of a man who lost his wife and chose to lift 472 strangers instead of one. The story does not end with a chant. The story does not end with a slogan. The story ends with a kettlebell that sits on a bench that sits in a small room at the back of a building named for a librarian named Adibola. The kettlebell waits. The plaque waits. The small room waits. The next barefoot boy waits. So the question I want to leave with you tonight is this. If you walked past the gate tomorrow morning and the man standing there wore a black polo and pressed trousers and twice polished shoes, would you point? Would you laugh? Would you look past the shoes and see the kettlebell he has been quietly carrying under his shirt since the morning his wife died?